Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. Today I have with me Angie Sanchez, and you are going to love this chat. So, Angie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I love the fact you're here, and I'm very excited to have this conversation because we're going
Thank
to chat about EQ. And I know everybody's
you.
going, what the heck is EQ? So, what is EQ and why is it important?
Yes, of course, we do need to start off with that definition. I feel like people hear it and they're like, you mean IQ? No, no,
No.
no, no. So EQ is the stuff I say they should be teaching us in school.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, they don't. Just an FYI, EQ and EI are used interchangeably. EQ is emotional intelligence,
Hmm.
versus in school, they teach us like your standard comprehension and English and math. And, it's all about strengthening and cultivating that IQ. And although that's great, and we need a lot of that practical knowledge, we need to understand and know how to process and manage our emotions and understand our emotional landscape. So, in a nutshell, that's what EQ is for and why we want to cultivate that and strengthen it. So, just at its most basic definition, the way that I describe it is becoming aware of your own feelings and emotions, as
Hmm.
well as those in your environment, and then using the data, the information from both to guide your thoughts, actions, behaviors, and decisions.
I love it. And I do agree with you. It should be taught in school because I it's very lacking. I think a piece of that is just common sense. When you've got common sense, you are, at least my definition growing up was you understood what was going on around you. You could read the room, you could read people, and I feel like we've lost a lot of that over the years.
Yeah. And I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but because of what I do for a living and what I see every single day, I wish I could say it's gotten better, but unfortunately it hasn't.
Yeah.
And
I know.
so I always say like this is this is why I'll always be booked and busy because
I
there's
hear
a
you.
lot of work that needs to be done.
A lot of work. And both of you and I are in the nutrition world,
Yeah.
and we both kind of work with the brain. You're working, a little bit different from a different angle than I am, but it's all about, calming this up
Yeah,
top. Because when your brain is balanced and you understand your own emotions and the emotions around you, you respond appropriately, everything below the neck gets better and it's easier to deal with.
that's a good point. I hadn't heard it that way. I loved how you just posed it that way. It's so true. Yeah,
Yeah, so true. So, how do you well, we define what emotional intelligence is, but what does it look like to assess somebody's emotional intelligence?
sure. So I like to break up uh, cultivating and strengthening emotional intelligence into three phases.
Okay.
And so that's kind of where I would start with everybody. I want them to understand that before anything happens, processing your emotions is the first thing that has to be gotten. That part has to be and by the way, that's the part where you start to see um, the evidence of, or not so much the evidence, the status of people's programming and
Mm-hmm.
how well or not well they can process things that they're experiencing or that they're feeling or that they're thinking. So that's stage one, learning how to process your emotional landscape. And then after that, stage two is understanding.
Mm.
Think about it this way. If we know how to process our emotional landscape, what we're feeling, what we're thinking, what we're experiencing, then we understand what's happening, what's going on for us,
Mm-hmm.
and as well as what's going on in our environment in a way that's not distorted, in a way that's very accurate, very, I can see things for what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third stage is managing or management of the emotion itself and therefore yourself. Because I know how to process my emotions accurately, I understand then accurately what's going on. Therefore, I know what I need to do to manage myself. So,
Ah,
what ends up happening when you go through these three stages and learn them very well, by default, you cultivate your emotional granularity, which is just what I say, like a short, easy way to remember it is like your emotional vocabulary.
Okay.
Learn how to precisely label an emotion and an emotional experience.
Wow. So when we go back to that first step, that processing,
Hmm.
you were just saying, you don't want to be pessimistic, but you feel like it's not really getting better out there.
Right.
Um, when we're talking about processing, you can kind of see that all over. We're in an environment, you know, all over this country where I don't feel like people can process very well.
Hmm.
And if you can't process, then you can't understand your point of view, much less somebody else's point of view, or what the common ground is in so many different areas. Um, so I feel like we've lost a lot of that. Why do you think that has happened, Angie?
So my subjective answer
Mm-hmm.
is that, you know, think about when we learn something that activates us in some way or triggers us, right? We become emotionally charged.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not so much that I want to say that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just what happens. And it ends up becoming a block to something so important like empathy, where you're just seeking to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So I always say if that goes out the window, empathy goes out the window, then discernment goes out the window, then critical
Right.
thinking skills goes out the window. So I just think that people are becoming and have become, especially since the pandemic,
Yeah, definitely.
so emotionally charged every time they experience something like cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of just a pattern that I would say I see very often that is very responsible uh,
Mm-hmm.
for that. And so I think I've just seen it enough right now that in a way, it's helped me also fine tune my systems in terms of what I teach with curriculum and in what order. Because man, at this point, I just say that cultivating strong EQ and having strong EQ is almost like a life skill at this
Yeah,
point.
definitely.
And yeah, I just think that usually it's that emotional charge that creates this domino effect, and then it's just people just spiral, and
Mm-hmm.
they really lose a grip on themselves. And as you know, that can be very dangerous in terms of even your health, because your perception
Definitely.
gets all screwed up. And we know that your perceptions can cause biological adaptations in the body. And
Mm-hmm.
if that's not resolved and that's not addressed, then here you are running off this program that you've never even taken the time to question if it still serves you or not. And you're not taking the time to kind of update your software, so to speak. And so that's why I say that this work is so important for everyone to do at some point in their lives, because you need to upgrade your software.
Oh, 100%. And you need to upgrade it often, right? Just think how
Often, yeah,
often.
it isn't. I just say maybe, at least once, because at the
Right.
bare minimum, but
Yeah.
we evolve, and evolution is something that's inevitable for all of us. And I just think that, contingent on what season of life you're in and what you've experienced, like it's always time for an upgrade every couple of years. I myself have gone through, I always say that I'm like by Angie 6.0 at this point.
Right?
Yeah.
It just keeps getting better. You're
Yes.
just a lot more
Yes.
emotionally in tune to yourself and those around you. And that has to help your relationships around you when
That
you're
is
able
what
to
benefits immediately.
process. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Especially the relationship you have with yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how does one start this process of assessing their own emotional intelligence?
Sure. So, what I have been seeing lately, and when I say lately, I want to say last maybe 5 years or so, is
Okay.
that a lot of colleges are now offering emotional intelligence courses or
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
some sort of EQ curriculum. It's not still something that you see common across the
Hmm.
board, but I
Yeah.
am seeing a lot more of it. So I always say, man, because I do coach teenagers as well. And
Hmm.
I always tell them, if at any point, you sit with your counselor and, you start going over electives or things like that, like you see something that pops up related to EQ, like run towards that course, sign up
Right.
immediately, because
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't matter what you end up, majoring in or doing for the rest of your life, you're going to need this. So that's a good way to start, especially if you're like a lot younger.
Yeah.
Um, and if not, there's teenagers too that their parents have been my clients, and they're like,
Mm-hmm.
my kid is doing this work. Um,
Uh-huh.
they're not, it's not being addressed in school. So then they'll hire a coach. So that's, I would say, like the next best alternative is seek a practitioner, seek a coach. There's a lot of therapists as well that are now taking more of like a coaching approach with the way
Right.
that we practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this for firsthand because I have two therapists right now on my roster who are my actual clients.
Nice.
And I've been working with them for a couple years now. And
Mm-hmm.
because of what they've experienced with me, it's almost inspired them to reevaluate the way that they practice with their clients and, try different modalities and methods and kind of take a page from our book and the things that they learn with me.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also seeking out therapists who perhaps have like an EQ background. You're seeing that a lot more because, therapy is, I'm not against it. I think that there's a place for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm an advocate for it for certain situations, especially when they're a little bit more extreme.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, but for the most part, there's a lot of outdated paradigms when it comes to therapy, which
Mm-hmm.
is why you're seeing a lot of therapists kind of like transition
Transition
out
into.
of that conventional role. And also like I I went to the University of Miami. I majored in psychology. A lot of the things that they even taught me back then, which is now over 15 years ago, I'm like, back then I even had not so much an issue with it, but there was so much resistance, which is why I didn't want to become a therapist even back then.
Right.
And I look back at that curriculum and I'm like, there's no way that me teaching that right now would be effective in any way, shape, or form. So this is why you're seeing this surge in
Mm-hmm.
coaches.
Oh,
And
100%.
there's people who they hear that someone's like a coach or a life coach and they kind of like roll their eyes. And then there's people who hear about it and they're like, well, they're doing God's work. They're filling in the
Mm-hmm.
gap. Thank God for coaches because they're kind of picking up where school left off.
Right.
So that's my long answer to your question of how does one get started? There's therapists who have coaching backgrounds now. There's coaches who specialize in EQ. And then, if you're a kid that's still in school or even a grad student, seek out the courses and speak to your guidance counselor to see if something exists right now in the curriculum. So,
Yeah. Can you give us an example of, somebody who's gone through your program or experienced this EQ transformation? Go through the stages and what that has looked like for that person?
okay. So I'm going to go with the first example that comes to mind. It's a little bit, I don't want to say extreme, but it just kind of showcases firsthand like how far this can go.
Okay.
So, a couple of years ago, this was before COVID, I had a client who I worked with her for only about a year. So she did two coaching phases with me. I do 6 months at a time.
Okay.
And at that point, after a year, we're like, okay, you don't have to continue if you don't want to. And I mean, she excelled, like she did great. She is an SLP, a speech language pathologist.
Okay.
However, at the time, she was working in a hospital setting.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like an outpatient center next to the hospital.
Yeah.
So um, I hadn't talked to her in a while, maybe about a year after she and I stopped coaching. And I received a text message from her that was quite lengthy.
Okay.
And essentially what she shared with me was, Ange, I know it's been a while since you and I have spoken, but I want to take the time to really acknowledge you and thank you for the work that you do, and how much it really has helped me. I had a very, very scary situation today at work when one of my colleagues, another SLP, ended up having a heart attack on the
Oh,
job.
wow. Mm-hmm.
And I saw everyone around me just panic and
Panic.
freeze.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I had thoughts that were running through my head and I myself was very scared, I was able to create movement, like actually like do something, like
Mm-hmm.
call,
Be
like help
proactive.
here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't like tense up. I was able to, logically and rationally understand like, okay, this is what we need to do. It was almost like I had the emotions, but I was able, in her words, to kind of put them over here in like a little box, and they didn't consume me, and I was able to perform.
Wow. That's
And
amazing.
so I'm using that example because emotions are always going to be there. We're emotional creatures before we are logical creatures. That's
Right.
why we are humans and not animals.
Yes.
And so if we know that that's a given about our how we were created, that part of us has to be learned and
Mm-hmm.
understood. And so when a person first begins to go through the process, I take them through that, understanding how they were created and hardwired, especially with their brain.
Mm-hmm.
We all have the same brain,
Right.
and that brain is designed for one thing. What is it?
It's to think and to feel and to
And to survive.
survive. Yes.
Yeah. So by default, that means that you are looking constantly and scoping out your environment, scanning
Right.
for what could go wrong. What
Mm-hmm.
do I need to be afraid of? What is a threat? What could be a threat? It's always looking at, glass half empty because
Right.
it's trying to protect you. It's trying to do its job. But as you know, not everything is a threat.
Right.
So what I tell people is when you don't do this work, you're consumed by this reptilian brain constantly. You don't know how to guide it in the right
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah.
This is where training your mind comes in.
Yes.
Training your emotions is also training your mind because the
Mm-hmm.
mind is responsible for the brain and the brain is responsible for the body.
Right.
So that is where we begin this work. And so once you understand that, we go through the stages, and that client was an example of someone who, saw everything through, had this SOS experience, which I know is a little bit on like the extreme end of the spectrum, but it happens.
But it happens and yeah.
And so just to hear her say that, I was like, wow, dude, like
Mm-hmm.
I have no words. This is why this work is important.
Right.
So
Right.
that's an example that comes to mind.
Yeah, because I think we get caught up in our world of drama, right? There's so much drama and chaos. We've kind of normalized that.
Yes.
And I know a few of my younger clients, I'm thinking of one in particular, she's sitting in my office and, we're doing the amino acid therapy and stuff. And but she's still like, really jazzed up. And I kind of, honestly, because she's just younger and I felt like this mama moment with her, I took my hands and put them on her face. I said, we don't have to react this way, right? It's
Mm,
okay not to live in chaos. And then at that moment, with her head still in my hand, she just broke down and cried. And she goes, nobody's ever said that to me. She goes, I can live outside of this. Like 100%. God doesn't want you to live in this chaos and in this just messy stuff that's going on in your brain. Like it doesn't have to be this hard.
a lot of times people think that that's normal.
Right. We just
It and
normalize
it's
dysfunction.
and it's what's familiar to them because it's
Yeah.
all that they saw. That's why those programs are so
Yes.
embedded, and takes deliberate, consistent action to deprogram that. And
Hmm.
you begin by questioning, I know it sounds silly, but you begin by questioning, why am I the way that I am?
Hmm.
Why is it that the same situation can be perceived like that by that person, but I perceive it this way,
Hmm. Right. So how
right?
does that happen? What goes on in the brain, Angie, when we've experienced trauma and chaos, from a young age? What goes on there?
Well, the CBT model in psychology, we use it in coaching too. It's very, very helpful, very simple. It's almost like I always say it's like a drop-down menu of four sections, right?
Hmm.
So it happens because we experience a situation. There's an event or a situation that takes place.
Okay.
And what people think is that when that event or situation takes place, that's why they feel the way they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is actually inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that they feel the way they do is because there's a part that comes before it that most
Okay.
people get because they're not aware of. So it's not event causes emotion. It's
Okay.
event causes thoughts.
Ah, okay.
You start to have thoughts about
Mm-hmm.
what you just experienced, which means that you're now interpreting the event and the situation a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
That interpretation is what elicits the emotions that you feel, which then results in the way you behave.
Mm,
So I always say you want to asterisk that second part, the thoughts and the
right.
interpretation, because that is where you have your power as it's a direct result of your programming.
Very good. I love that.
So you want to seek to understand the nature of those thoughts, the nature of that interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
because it's going to come directly from your programming. It's going to come from, which by the way, becomes solidified at the age of 12.
Really? Okay.
Yes, that is in subconscious world, subconscious mind world, that is around the age that they say it's been pretty much formed.
Okay.
So you'll have people that when they're first learning this work, they're like, yeah, but I had this trauma that happened to me when I was 18. And so my programming comes from that trauma that happened when I was 18. And so what I say is, I hear you. I'm not saying that that doesn't play a role, but you have to consider why was that event that traumatic and why was it perceived how it was and interpreted how it was at
Mhm.
18, which has to do with the program that you
Programming.
had
Fire.
prior.
Gotcha.
And that's why it created the type of trauma that it did.
That's amazing. Amazing. So how has this transformed you?
Oh God. That is such a loaded question. I still feel like I'm being transformed, to be honest with
Right? It never stops, right, Angie?
you. It never stops. I'm just being super honest about that. Well, what I can tell you is this. The best way to summarize my transformation is that I consider myself to be a former emotional slave,
That's great. Mm-hmm.
and I am no longer an emotional slave.
Mm-hmm.
So, as someone who was diagnosed with clinical depression at the age of 21,
Mm-hmm.
and it lasted for about 3 years, and then developed binge eating disorder soon after as a way to cope with the depression. Yeah, there were a lot of things in my program that were not serving me. And I had a lot of questions because now that I look back at that time, there was just so much I didn't understand. And not even just from my external environment, but my internal environment, because I didn't know how to process.
Mm-hmm.
There were these gaps that were there that
Right?
later on when I, overcame it and got older and became a coach, I was like, we need to fill those gaps. It almost like I've been asked a question, what angers you? Because
Okay.
usually when people are on this mission and have this like embedded deep purpose that they're so
Mm-hmm.
passionate about, it's like something set you off.
That is
So,
true. Yes.
right. So the thing that I would say kind of set me off was that I was like, wow, I got so tired of people hearing about what happened to me. And they kind of had the same comment where they're like, how did this bright, young, intelligent, like passionate, powerful girl who had it all together all of a sudden go from like being top of the mountain to being rock bottom? Like, how does one
Right.
let that happen to them?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, great question, because I want to know the answer too.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I think just that sparked, first and foremost, a curiosity. And then as I began to explore deeper, I arrived at, the EQ stuff. And yeah, that's kind of what started my transformation that I got myself out of it for the most part. And I say like the residual, like what was left of it came at age 25 when I hired my first coach
Ah,
after therapy not working.
right. Mm-hmm.
And so that just kind of, spearheaded my mission, so to speak. That was like the catalyst for it, so to speak. And then, after that, I've had, I would say, like a handful of big events happen in my life that have
Mm-hmm.
continued to transform me.
Yep.
And so here we are. And I almost kind of feel like I'm going through another one right now. I don't know if you're familiar with the term dark night of the soul.
I am. Yes. You want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's I guess like a good way to put it is like it's a spiritual awakening of some sort
Mm-hmm.
to everything you once knew about you and about the world. And because it's a very dark time, it can feel very lonely. You can feel very lost. You can feel very confused.
Yeah.
Things don't make sense. At least for me, when I experienced my first one at age 21, I felt almost like duped, like deceived.
Ah, mm-hmm.
Everything that my family, my teachers, my environments like instilled in me, I'm like, what? Like, this can't be it. And it's actually not it. And wait, that's not the what. And there was that is
Mm-hmm.
what started I guess it was like an identity crisis,
Okay, sure.
right? And
Yeah.
then the emotions that came with that were like frustration, confusion, sadness, grieving, uh,
Mm-hmm.
fear, and I didn't understand.
Right. Because
And
why,
then
why would you understand? Because, you weren't
I
prepared for that.
became, I became I was
Mm-hmm.
the embodiment of depression,
Right.
which is why it happened. And so a dark night of the soul is actually disguised as something that's beautiful. I think people need to understand what it looks like when it shows up. And that's a time for sure to go within, but to have a guide with you
Mm-hmm.
to take you
Mm-hmm.
through that. So I was fortunate to do that probably like 2 years in.
Nice.
Like I said, it lasted for a couple years and it became the catalyst for the transformation for sure. But I couldn't go through it alone.
Right. We're not meant to go through it alone.
No, that's why I'm so grateful for practitioners like yourself doing God's work, practitioners like our mutual friend Ben Azadi,
Yes.
brought us together. And I just like we need to keep doing this. Like we're so needed now more than ever.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love this conversation, Angie, because we could do nutrition all day long, which is very important, right?
Sure.
I
It is.
always tell my clients, like, you you can't get well with an amazing diet, but you can't get well without an amazing diet either. Like, so there's a huge component there. And then,
Bingo.
we work on the brain, balancing, fixing the deficiencies. And then, we get into what you're talking about, because if we don't do that work,
Mm-hmm.
we've got, not all the pieces of the puzzle there, right? And
It's
so we're
incomplete.
missing a lot, and the people are still floundering and not sure where to go. And for some people, it's going to look a lot different. And I can think of a couple clients in particular that, um, I haven't, and it's not all my responsibility either, but I haven't helped them navigate this piece very well because I'm so focused on, what I do, my main thing. And so I love bringing in somebody like yourself who can peel off those other layers and help them to see things, just kind of take off those foggy glasses for people and
Absolutely.
unwind, like, where is this stuck emotion? Because when people don't get well, like they've done everything right, we know that there's this ginormous emotional piece that is keeping them from being all that God has called them to be, right?
Yes, ma'am. You just said something very important. That piece is really the perception piece.
Right.
It's the perception piece because even remember, the perception is what causes you to feel how you do, like why you choose to feel the way you do. It
Hmm.
elicits that emotion. So I always say that the gold, the answers are in that perception.
Hmm.
And in the perception is where you'll see your body adapt
Yeah.
to whatever that is for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of my son in all of this. He's 26 now and he's married. They just had a baby, and
Oh,
so I'm a new grandma.
I was
Um,
just gonna say you're grandma
I
now.
am, which is really amazing. But he's just always been that kid, just thinking of him, with some other friends in his life that, my husband says it just always works out for him. I say, yeah, because he never perceives that it won't,
Mhm.
right? Like if he sees something, he's like, I want to try that, I want to do that, and then he just
Go
does.
for it, yeah.
Yeah, there's not a lot of inhibition there. There's not a lot of like negative self-talk. So I really admire how he navigates life. And then you can contrast that to somebody else who's just very afraid to even take that next step. That person who says, it just never works out for me. I try and I try and I try, and I always fail. And so their emotional intelligence is vastly different, right? Vastly different. And I'm like, you see that and you're like, I just want to peel that off for you.
Well, I mean, that's an insight into their programming and
Yeah,
do have an opportunity because I was just going to say your son, that's just an indication that your son not only has pretty high EQ, but his programming serves him.
right.
He
Right.
has access. So it's not that your son is naive. It's just, I think it sounds like your son understands that what could go wrong is just as available to me as what could go right.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so, why am I going to choose to focus on what could go wrong when what I want is what could go right? And they're both
Mhm.
just as available.
Right. And if it doesn't work out, you just move on. It's not something you have to get caught up in, which I get oh, what if this fails? And then I have to kind of unwind that in my brain and say, go, well, what if it's successful? And, to go on to that next phase.
I always like to say, I'm glad you brought up what the phrase "what if." I always like to
Mhm.
say, for every "what if" that you have, replace it with "even if."
Even if, oh, I love it. I love it. Even if.
Well, because what if whatever happens, okay, well, even if that were to happen, here's what I could do, or here's what I would do. And then now you're talking about having access to what Tony Robbins calls the ultimate resource that we all have in common universally, resourcefulness.
Mm-hmm.
So when people ask me about how I built my business and how I did it so unafraid, they're like, "How did you do that from scratch the way that you did? And weren't you scared? Like, weren't you afraid?" And I'm just like, "Yeah, I mean, I did it with a little bit of fear, but I knew that executing was going to give me just a lot of feedback about how I needed to pivot or readjust. Where
Sure.
what if these things were to happen? I would be like, well, even if they were to happen, here's what I can do instead. And it's just being resourceful is just something that um, it's having that belief and the ability to figure it out as you go
Yeah.
and being okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it.
I know so many questions. We
So
can
many
go.
questions. Like, because I'm just loving this conversation because it's the key. I feel like it's like the missing piece that we have going on in society right now.
Well,
Um,
that's how I felt when
yeah,
I was a youngin' in my early 20s. Yeah.
yeah, because we have so many kids that just don't know what to do next. And not that, I mean, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do when, I was 18 either, but you just pick something and you started to do it, right?
Mhm.
But there seems to be this whole like trepidation of just even what if I pick the wrong thing to start with?
Yes.
And then
Yes.
I'm stuck there.
Mhm.
How do you help people get past that, Angie?
That's fear of failure.
Fear of failure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think learning how to manage your relationship to failure is a great starting point. What do you make failure mean? I'm always very interested in what people make things mean. Again,
Hmm.
perception, right? So I'm interested in hearing what's your definition in this case of failure, and then you kind of hear, you know, dead end, or I'm
Yeah.
worthless, or that's just what was the point? I wasted my time. It's just and when you really, really break down failure, what you really arrive at its core is, well, think about it. That gave you feedback about
Hmm.
your approach, about your strategy, the way you went about something, the timing, the people that you higher, whatever it was,
Hmm.
that you're getting feedback as a result of that failure. So instead of being upset that you failed, how can we utilize that feedback so that we then try again?
Right.
So now, if you think about it, failure is not only feedback, it's also opportunity. And my favorite, it's redirection.
Very much so.
It's completely shifting gears where maybe you
Yeah,
were headed down this path, which is why it didn't work. And because you failed, that was like the sign that you needed to not go down that path anymore and to go down this path instead. But you would have never known that had you not failed.
that is true.
So it's about learning to embrace that failure is part of the recipe for success. And then
Hmm.
once you can understand that, you don't really what if it as much.
Right. Right. So we
Yeah.
were talking a lot about this first piece, the processing piece.
Yeah.
So, which I think is, I mean, clearly, if you can't process, you can't manage. So, but
Mhm.
once somebody gets through the processing piece, Angie, and they go into that management piece, what does that look like? Like, can you
Yeah.
give us some examples of that?
Yeah, so learning how to manage your emotions, obviously, it's very contingent on the first two stages. So I think that management is very successful when you can really see things for what they are. So when we go through the management piece, this is where I like to teach about distorted thinking.
Mm,
So distorted thinking, there's about 15 cognitive distortions in the literature that I like to go through each one with every client and kind of spend some time in each one, especially if they do it, which I assess them on that. We, at the end come up with a list of yeses or nos. And the ones that are yeses, a way that we learn to manage ourselves is to go over the yeses, right?
hmm.
So if you are aware that you do this, and for example, you're aware that you do this and you think it's normal, you're like, oh my God, I've done this, my entire life, then I'm like,
Right?
cool, we need to take some time then to understand, like I'll give them an example or I'll have them give me an example where they know that they drew it. We need to understand why you did it this way. Why is it that you, for example, filtering
Hmm.
a common distortion? And so once we kind of see that play out with whatever example they provide or I provide for them, then we apply the interruption or what I say, the antidote.
Okay.
So once you start them to learn interruptions and antidotes to these distortions, that's an example of how you start to learn how to manage yourself. Because the idea here is not to get to a place where you never exhibit distorted thinking. No, it's to become aware of what it looks like when
Hmm.
you do it, or if you're interacting with someone who is exhibiting a style of distorted thinking, and because you have that knowledge, you know how to nip it in the bud with
Yeah.
yourself
Uh-huh.
or how to talk to someone who is exhibiting it in a way where it helps nip it in the bud in the conversation. Like, how do I
Right.
redirect the conversation knowing that they're approaching this with me from a very distorted space? So it almost like
Yeah.
provides you with the appropriate cues just by learning the interruptions to each one. So
I
that's
love
an
it.
example of management.
Okay. That sounds
Mhm.
amazing. Like
It's
life would just be
my
so
favorite.
easy. Life would
It's
be so
my
much better,
favorite to
right?
teach. Yeah, it's my favorite to teach for sure. I have such a good time. That's also where we spend the most time in our curriculum because there's 15 of them.
Okay. That's a lot.
hmm
Hmm. So do you do this in a group coaching setting? Are you doing one-on-one? What do you do, Angie?
I do one-on-one coaching.
Okay.
It's funny you got to meet my boyfriend earlier
Yeah.
briefly. He's also a coach, and we talk about this very often. I considered scaling my business several times.
Hmm.
And every time I go to do it, because I want to serve more people,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
I have a little bit of resistance to it.
Hmm.
And then I explore that and I always come back to I just love the power of one-on-one.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I've had a coach, as I said, since I was 25, where
Hmm.
what's taken place in that individual setup that's been tailored to my bio individuality
Yeah.
has been so priceless. And so I'm not saying that group coaching or courses are not effective. I've just realized that, my bread and butter and what I really enjoy is one-on-one. So
Yeah,
I've decided to just stick to the one-on-one. So that's what I do right now. I have clients, which is so beautiful, from all over the world,
I
from
love that.
different countries and
Hmm.
so forth. And then he's more of a group coaching guy.
Okay, I love
Yeah.
it.
So I'm like, listen, that's I'll do the one-on-one, you do the group coaching. He does do one-on-one too, but he loves doing like group settings. And then outside of one-on-one coaching, I used to do them more often, but I kind of took a little bit of a hiatus. I used to do workshops all the time.
Mhm.
So I'm still very open to that. I used to do them a lot. I used to do like big workshops 4 or 5 times a year. I used to pick a topic, and then for that year,
Hmm.
the workshop at different venues so that people can have
Yeah.
multiple opportunities if they couldn't go to the first one. But that's as far as I go with my offering. It's a very one-on-one, it's very exclusive. And I open for enrollment twice per year, usually
Okay.
spring, which is coming up next month,
Yeah.
and fall around October.
Gotcha. I love it. I think everybody should have you as a coach. I know you can't do everybody, but
I appreciate that. Yeah. And you know
hmm
what? I love most of my clients are older than me. And
hmm
I just love working with people who are just more on paper mature than me, just wiser, have
hmm
gone because it's actually more challenging because the programming is more embedded.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
I think I just enjoy that challenge so much
Right.
more.
And I would think you would learn a lot more too. I mean, not just from that embedded programming, but just, talking
Yeah,
with people who have been through more of life than you.
absolutely. And those are the ones that stick around for I have clients still with me from day one.
That's amazing, Angie.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you get to a point in life, you're like, this has to stop. Like this cycle has to stop. You really start to recognize it. There, you just hit a point in life. And I think, most people it's like 40 or above where you're like, this has got to stop.
And to your point, a lot of people say that because they're seeing how it leaks into
Yeah.
their household and
Yeah,
environment
we
and
don't want our kids to experience that. We don't want our grandkids to
Mhm.
experience that. We want this peaceful, calm, beautiful life that is, for generations to come. We want to break that generational cycle.
Absolutely. So when I hear, um, I like to do testimonials every now and then. When I hear someone share with me or write, this work has directly impacted my household,
Mm,
my husband, my wife, my children. It's so evident. It created such a ripple effect. You have no idea. That I'm like, that is what I came here to do.
yeah,
I know what it's like to grow up in a household where there was zero EQ.
right.
And don't get me wrong, I have a great family. I had pretty decent childhood. It was,
Hmm.
but the programming was the programming, and the programming
Yeah.
resulted in a lot of things. And, I now understand, which is what I love about this work. It's allowed me to truly practice empathy with my family and
Mm,
how everything was for them. And, it explains a lot of things. And it also allows you to um, see and respect and honor their humanity, that they really did the best that they did with what they had.
right. Right. And that's so important.
So
Um,
important. So, so important.
yeah, because we never want to play the blame game on our family because they were just doing what they knew how to do.
It's up to you to
Yeah.
now, like, okay, well, I understand that that was painful, that that was hard, that that was difficult, that this affected you in this way. What are you going to do about it now?
Yeah.
How are you going to take responsibility for it? Because if that's not the approach, in my opinion, that you take, you're a victim.
And we don't want people to live as victims. No, that doesn't solve anything.
No, and I'm sure, you see your fine line of that with
Mhm.
the clients that you work with. And,
Yeah,
sometimes that you got to start from there with them because
you do.
yeah, they're especially if they're sick and they have all these symptoms and
Yeah.
these chronic conditions that they're so tired of and not, seeing results and they're kind of like in this hamster wheel. It's so easy to fall into victimhood.
Yeah.
I've been there before,
Oh
so I
yeah, me too.
understand. Yeah.
Hmm.
Oh God.
Yeah. And you can feel yourself kind of slinking back sometimes, and you have to be able to recognize that and say, nope, this is not where we're going
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I'm responsible for me.
Personal responsibility is the road to true power and happiness and peace.
Yeah.
So I'm always like, things happen, and I'm always like, okay, how can I take responsibility? What can
Hmm.
I do about this? I contributed. If I experienced it, then I played a role and I contributed to the co-creation of this experience in reality in some way, shape, or form. So I need to take responsibility for that.
Yeah.
And when we're sick, the same thing applies.
Hmm.
When we are sick, the same thing applies.
Right. Which is hard to remember.
It is,
Yeah.
yeah, I can go off on such a tangent with that with chronic illness, and I'm sure you see it more often than I do.
Yeah.
And it's rampant.
It is rampant. It is rampant. Yeah. And people just, they want to be well and they just get so stuck. And I've been there. I get it. But got to be able to get ourselves out of that emotionally as well as physically. So, because otherwise you just won't be whole. Yeah. Andy, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you very much.
It's been it's been a great time. Yeah,
Yeah.
way better than I could have imagined. I mean, I had no expectations, but I feel like we're friends and we
Yeah.
can just talk for hours about this.
Oh, I know. I know. It's so good. Is there anything else you want to say before we say goodbye?
Just keep doing God's work because you are
Yeah.
doing God's work and providing this space for uh, like-minded minds to find you and
Yeah.
continue to have these conversations. And I think it's important to do everything that we can to let people know that we exist as a resource and
Yeah.
as an answer. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Well, I will have all of your information in the show notes for everyone listening. And I know you have a opening coming up where
I
people
do next month.
next month. So, make sure you check Angie out. And thank you so much. God bless
Thank
you.
you, Laurie. I
All
appreciate
right.
you. God bless you too.
Okay. And God bless all of you. I will see you in the next episode. Bye.